There was an ecological breakdown as well, beginning with the departure of Adam and Eve from the garden, the difficulty in childbirth, and their toil to live from the earth, which was not there before.
But how is this not all God's fault as well? God created Adam and Eve with morally significant free will, the ability to go against his will. If indeed the Christian God's description is accurate and said God is all-knowing, God knew in advance when he put Adam and Eve in the garden that when he put the tree there, and the serpent that tempted them, I might add, he knew in advance what they were going to do and how they were going to behave, and that they were going to disobey him, and that he was going to banish them to a fallen world as a consequence. So knowing all that and putting all those pieces in place, why the hell did he do it? And how is he not responsible for this? How does this get leveled at the foot of humanity? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to make you aware of my Patreon. So guys, for as little as £3 per month or as much as £50 per month, you can support my mission here on my channel, The Magic Skeptic. And so if you want to gain access to all sorts of bonuses and extras, including things like downloadable episodes of my podcast that are ad-free and audio-only that you can listen to on the go, or perhaps you want to have a question answered in a monthly video, or, you know, better still, maybe you want to sit down and have an actual Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. If all of that sounds good, well, it's all available in my Patreon. As I said, for as little as £3 per month or as much as 50, you can gain access to a plethora of bonuses and extras. And so if that sounds good, you can check out the link to my Patreon in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hello everybody, Magic Skeptic here, aka Magic Dara, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. In a rather peculiar, strange, and unique moment, I'm going to begin this episode with the admission that God exists. For the sake of discussion, of course. Don't worry, I haven't become a theist, I'm still an atheist. So guys, for this conversation, I want you to go on this journey with me. I want you to assume, just for the sake of this video, that God exists. That is absolutely central for the discussion we're about to have here. For if we get into existential questions, we won't be able to get to where we need to get to in order to expose the meat of this conversation. So, from the word go here, God exists. Okay? With that acknowledged, let's continue. So why am I saying that God exists for the sake of this video? Well, guys, what I want to discuss in this video is something known as the free will defense. Now, if you don't know what the free will defense is, don't worry, I'll explain it. The first question, I suppose, is what's it defending against? Why is it called the free will defense? Well, that's a great question. It's called the free will defense because it's defending against a particular problem, and that problem is known as the problem of evil.
The problem of evil in this world is that it, first of all, affects both the innocent and the guilty. There doesn't seem to be any justice. Sometimes innocent people suffer. This is a sad reality of life. Some people think that a good and all-powerful God, what the Christian concept of God is, that a good and all-powerful God could and should prevent evil if he wanted to.
It was Epicurus who reasoned that if God is all-powerful and if God is all-loving, then evil surely shouldn't exist. Epicurus sketched out what he called the inconsistent triad. If you imagine a triangle and you have evil exists on one corner, you have God is all-powerful on another, and you have God is all-loving on the remaining corner, Epicurus reasoned that one of these statements cannot be true. If evil exists, God cannot be both all-powerful and all-loving, because an all-powerful and all-loving being would make it such that evil wasn't a problem. If indeed evil does exist, one of those has got to go. So either God is all-loving and can't stop it because he's not all-powerful, or God is all-powerful and doesn't care enough to stop it because he's not all-loving. The only other option that remains is that evil doesn't exist, which is the approach of certain theists. They will say that evil is simply the privation of goodness. It is simply the absence of goodness.
But there's a more fundamental metaphysical point, that evil is a privatio boni, right? Evil is a privation of the good. Therefore, starting with evil is always a problematic thing. It's metaphysically incoherent because it's always a privation of a greater good, like a cavity in a tooth.
In any case, theists down throughout the centuries have addressed Epicurus's so-called inconsistent triad in many ways. In other words, the problem of evil. How can there be evil, specifically for Christians here? Because if you believe in a deistic God, if you believe in a God that just got everything started and then pissed off, well then the problem of evil isn't a problem for you. It just isn't an issue. This problem of evil is a problem for anybody who believes in a theistic, interventionist God, the kind of God that can answer prayers, the kind of God that can perform miracles and send their only begotten Son to die for our sins. In other words, dear listener, if you're going to argue that when the baby is saved from the burning building, that's God's work, well then you have to explain why all those people in the cancer ward over there are dying in misery and suffering. So with all that acknowledged, the free will defense attempts to argue that evil exists because of us, because human beings have free will, and God created us with this free will because free will is an intrinsic good.
You see, without free will, man is not in the image of God. That's the important thing. He is less than human. He is not all that he was created to be. Man must be able to glorify God willingly and freely, because worship which is not offered freely and willfully, which is automated, is no worship at all. It is an insult to Almighty God. In other words, in order to be in the image of God, man had to possess free will.
If you just imagine for a moment that God created us such that we could only do good things. If God created us as moral robots, the kinds of humans who could only do loving things, only be charitable, only be courageous, only be decent, if that's the way we were created, without the capacity to commit murders, rapes, and thefts, if those kinds of behaviors weren't possible, then our goodness would become meaningless. And you know, I find that to be quite persuasive. I think that's quite an interesting point. You cannot know what a crooked line is unless you can compare it to a straight one, right? If I was to be charitable and donate all of my income to cancer research, for example, how would that matter, or why would it matter if that's what everybody automatically does and there's no choice in the matter? If there's no choice, then the behavior becomes meaningless. If we're all just on a railway of moral goodness and decency, a track from which we cannot veer, the whole sense of goodness and respect that we have for people who sacrifice in order to do good, it kind of goes out the window. So there is a very interesting argument here as to why God, again, remember, God exists in this video. There is a very interesting reason why God creates us with freedom, because that's the true test of a person's character.
In order to be in the image of God, man had to possess free will.
If we are moral robots who always do good, goodness becomes meaningless. So God had to give us free will, and the cost or the price of free will is evil. The price of free will is evil.
You know, God doesn't arbitrarily remove evil because first of all, it is the direct result of man's choice. And to remove evil is to remove choice. And to remove choice is to eliminate man as a free-thinking, independent, eternal being.
To get even deeper in this, we have to differentiate between the two kinds of evil that exist. Those are moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is quite obviously covered by this free will defense, isn't it? So if you want to talk about the Holocaust, if you want to talk about murder, if you want to talk about any kind of vicious crime imaginable, that crime happens because a crappy human decided to do it. That is evidently not God's fault. It is the fault of the morally responsible and free agent who commits that act. Fair enough. How then does this address natural evil? Natural evil, things like volcanoes and tsunamis and hurricanes, that's not our fault as free agents. We don't choose for those things to happen. And in response to that, there are 2 points. Number one is, Our free choices do contribute to natural disasters. Global warming, for example, our destruction of forests and all the rest of it. These things have negative consequences on our lives. Our pollution of the atmosphere and the world in which we live increases the incidences of natural disasters and contributes overall to the immiseration of all human beings. So that's one thing. But you might say, Magic Skeptic, those kinds of disasters predate our overproduction of carbon dioxide, and so the problem is still in God's court. God created these natural evils. And to that, the defense, the free will defense, pivots to none other than Adam and Eve.
Now here's the problem. The problem with free will is that man had the choice to obey and enjoy life in perfect harmony, without evil, without suffering, or disobey and destroy his relationship with God and other men, the creation itself, and bring evil and suffering into the world. He had the power to do both. We know the story, don't we? It should have been an easy choice, but because of the previous disobedience of Satan and his seductive ways, man chose to disobey and bring all of the calamity of suffering crashing down on his and, of course, our heads today.
You see, guys, human beings were put in a perfect environment. We were granted the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and we lived harmoniously in the Garden of Eden until Adam and Eve used their free will to break God's rules. And that's the reason we live in this fallen world. So even on the natural evil front, the reason we live in a world with all of these natural evils is because when we lived in a world without them, we revealed as human beings our lack of gratitude for that fact. We took it for granted and we broke God's law, and so we were banished to a fallen world. That is the free will defense, guys. The free will defense puts evil at the foot of human beings and spares God, right? It addresses the inconsistent triad that Epicurus erected. So God is still all-powerful and all-loving. Evil isn't his fault. Evil exists because human beings choose for it to exist. We choose to do bad things. We chose to do bad things in the garden, which banished us to a world with natural evil. And in this fallen world, we also choose to do bad things to each other, which covers moral evil. That's the free will defense. So what do you think? Does this defense protect God from criticism? Is God free of any responsibility here? Well, John Mackie, a very famous philosopher, disagreed famously with the free will defense because he suggested, and these were his words, not mine, why could God not have made men such that they always freely choose the good? If there is no logical impossibility in a man's freely choosing the good on one or on several occasions, there cannot be logical impossibility in his freely choosing the good on every occasion. There was open to God the obviously better possibility of making beings who would act freely but always go right. Summarized, Mackie's position is the free will defense fails because God could have created humanity with freedom, but the kind of freedom where we only and ever do good actions. I'm sure you're listening to this and thinking to yourself, Mackie is insane. But before you dismiss Mackie, let's get into this. Alvin Plantinga responded to John Mackie's argument here, and he said that what Mackie articulates is in fact an impossibility. Plantinga illustrated this point with reference to 3 possible worlds. Possible world 1 is a world where God creates human beings with morally significant free will so that we can choose to do good or bad actions. In possible world 1, clearly evil exists. There's nothing illogical about possible world 1. We are free, so we have the option to do good and bad things. In possible world 2, God creates human beings without morally significant free will, such that we can only and inevitably always do the right thing. We can only ever be loving, compassionate, decent, and kind. Please notice that in possible world 2, while there is no evil, we are not free, because we're not free to do bad actions. There's nothing logically impossible about possible world 2. It's just that in possible world 2, we don't have free will. And then we get to possible world number 3, the world that Mackie is suggesting in his comments on the free will defense. In possible world 3, human beings are created with morally significant free will, the free will to be able to do good and bad, and yet, in possible world 3, there is no moral evil. Human beings always do the right thing. Plantinga argues that possible world 3 is actually an impossibility. It's logically contradictory. As Plantinga put it, free to choose must mean that there is a real choice between real options. Being made in such a way that you can only choose the good is not a free choice. You are doing what God has made you do. So Plantinga's response here is quite reasonable, wouldn't you say? It doesn't really make sense to say or to suggest that we can be created with morally significant free will, but always do the good, right? How can we be really free if it's impossible for us to do evil? That doesn't make sense. It's incoherent. And this was Plantinga's criticism of Mackie's comment on the free will defense. So perhaps the free will defense stands. What do you think? So in my view, guys, the free will defense fails. And I've got no less than 4 reasons for this. So again, just to reiterate, the free will defense is suggesting that God is not responsible for the evil that we see in this world, that it is our fault. When Mackie suggests that God could have created a world where we are both free and always do the right thing, Plantinga might very well be correct in saying that such a possible world is actually incoherent and illogical. But if Plantinga is going to make that claim, then Plantinga has to answer the following question. And this is a very simple question indeed, and it goes something like this. Is there free will in heaven? Think about that. Christians will say that there is in fact free will in heaven, and yet no evil occurs in heaven.
I think the thing that I'm going to enjoy the most about heaven, no sin.
Something worth considering. So by Plantinga's own theological standards, it is in fact possible for there to be a state of affairs where people have morally significant free will and still always do the right thing. Is that not the third possible world that Plantinga argued was incoherent and illogical? And yet, isn't that exactly the possible world that heaven is? And if it was possible for God to create beings that have morally significant free will and bring them to a heavenly realm where no evil ever occurs, then surely that was possible on earth as well. The only way you can get around this is to say, well, God gave us a different kind of morally significant free will on earth. But if you're going to say that, your free will defense goes out the window, because the free will defense wants to allege that human beings are responsible for the evil that happens in our world. But if you're going to suggest that God gave us a special kind of free will that permits us to do evil, well, then the ball is in God's court. God could have given us the kind of free will that exists in heaven, where no evil ever happens, but instead he gave us the kind of free will that exists on earth, where people can rape, murder, and steal. So this would put the ball back in God's court and would reveal God as the villain of this piece. So again, your free will defense falls apart. As soon as a Christian or any believer in heaven acknowledges that there is free will in heaven, then they have to acknowledge that it's possible to have free will while simultaneously avoiding evil. Now, again, the other way out of this is to deny that there's free will in heaven. But if you're going to deny that there's free will in heaven, and yet you're saying God gave us free will on earth because it's an intrinsic good.
You see, without free will, man is not in the image of God.
Well, then you're saying that there's the opposite of an intrinsic good in heaven because we're not free. In other words, heaven has a negative element. And again, you shoot yourself in the foot. Guys, it doesn't matter which way you run this conversation. Whether there's free will in heaven or not, you have to swallow a bitter pill. If there's no free will in heaven, heaven has a negative aspect to it. We become moral robots in heaven, and then heaven becomes an ugly domain. So they won't acknowledge that. If you want to go with free will in heaven, well, then you must bite the bullet that it was possible for us to have free will on earth and also have no evil, like there isn't any evil in heaven. No matter what way you run this, there's a very unpleasant, theological, bitter pill to swallow for the Christian. So again, I ask you, is there free will in heaven? If so, your free will defense is defeated. The other problem with the free will defense is that it seeks to remove God's responsibility, and it does so in a manner which your intuition will not accept were it expressed in a different context. Let me give you that context. If I, dear listener, created a robot that had morally significant free will, a robot that could either go out and be charitable, loving, decent, and kind, and help an old person, for example, carry their shopping across the road, but if it was also free to go out and murder and steal and kill and become a Terminator of sorts, you would blame the inventor. You would say, Magic Skeptic, you designed a robot that is wreaking havoc in our society. That's your fault. Now, if I am at fault, dear listener, for creating a robot that has the capacity to hurt people, well then how isn't God responsible for creating human beings who have the capacity to hurt each other? I think this is a totally fair and airtight analogy. I don't see any reason for this analogy here. I don't see any incoherency in the comparison. If God created human beings such that they can do good or they can do bad, and then they go out and do bad, well then God must be blamed for creating something that can behave in this manner. Again, whatever way you cut this, God is responsible to one extent or another. You can't give God a free pass because, oh, I created you with freedom, so it was your choice after that. Again, if I created a robot with freedom and it started causing mayhem, you would rightly blame me. Have you seen the Terminator movies? Miles Dyson creates the microchip, reverse engineers the microchip that leads to the destruction of the human species. And he is blamed for that. He is responsible for creating that invention. And so he is blamed for it. And again, that makes perfect sense to me. Intentional or unintentional, and I guess Miles Dyson in this story of Terminator is just a human, so he may not have foreseen the evil that was going to come of his invention, but you can't say that about God. God would have foreseen exactly what his human creations were going to do. And so he's even more culpable. I say to you, dear listener, if indeed I had the gift of foresight and I knew in advance that when I create my robot, it was going to carry out a genocide, would you not say I was immoral for creating it despite that knowledge? Of course you would. You would say, Magic Skeptic, you are an immoral scumbag for going ahead with the creation of that robot despite your foreknowledge that it would commit a genocide. If you are moral, you would have either redesigned the robot such that that wasn't a possibility, or you would have abandoned the project altogether. So we're left with the question, if God did create us, why did he do so if he knew that the future was going to be what it became? The third problem with the free will defense, and let's face it, this is the elephant in the room, its explanation for natural evil is spectacularly weak.
After the fall of Adam, there was not only a broken relationship with God, causing moral darkness, resulting in evil and suffering, he says there was also social breakdown, evidenced by the shame that Adam and Eve felt and the murder of Abel by Cain. In addition to this, he claims that there was an ecological breakdown as well, beginning with the departure of Adam and Eve from the garden, the difficulty in childbirth, and their toil to live from the earth, which was not there before. He goes on to show that social disintegration continued until the greatest natural disaster in history occurred, the Great Flood.
I will grant you that the free will defense's explanation for moral evil is persuasive. It doesn't convince me I've explained why already, but I can see why it's persuasive for people. It makes sense to me that moral evil is our fault. It makes sense intuitively that human beings would be blamed for that, because at the end of the day, those are our actions, and we, to one extent or another, must own them. Natural evil is not the same. The free will defense wants to say that natural evil, volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, etc., are also the fault of human beings for making bad choices. Speaking specifically, of course, of the bad choices that Adam and Eve made in the Garden of Eden, which resulted in our banishment and our fall to this ugly earth that we live upon.
There was an ecological breakdown as well, beginning with the departure of Adam and Eve from the garden, the difficulty in childbirth, and their toil to live from the earth, which was not there before.
But how is this not all God's fault as well? God created Adam and Eve with morally significant free will, the ability to go against his will. If indeed the Christian God's description is accurate and said God is all-knowing, God knew in advance when he put Adam and Eve in the garden that when he put the tree there, and the serpent that tempted them, I might add, he knew in advance what they were going to do and how they were going to behave, and that they were going to disobey him, and that he was going to banish them to a fallen world as a consequence. So knowing all that and putting all those pieces in place, why the hell did he do it? And how is he not responsible for this? How does this get leveled at the foot of humanity? It doesn't make any sense at all. Now, if you want to change the definition of God and say that God is not all-knowing and he did not have foreknowledge, even then this defense falls apart, because let's just run with it. Okay, God didn't know that by putting the serpent and the tree and giving them the rule that Adam and Eve were going to break the rule. Fair enough. But God still had a choice over how he punished humanity for breaking those rules. And the best punishment he could come up with was banishing human beings to a world that's filled with volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, natural disasters, disease, cancer. Are you kidding me? God couldn't think of a better punishment than that? The only punishment, the righteous punishment, the best punishment God could think of for humanity, for the finite crime of going near the forbidden tree. The best punishment he could think of was to banish us to a land of torture, immiseration, and suffering. And you want to tell me that this is humanity's fault? This is the equivalent, again, dear listener, if I change the analogy and change the context, your intuition will recognize it for the obscene and immoral conduct that it is. This is the equivalent of a parent setting up a rule for a child, telling them, when I leave the house, make sure you don't go near the pantry, for example. Or, when I leave the house, make sure you don't go near the ornament on the counter. Sure enough, when the parent leaves the house, the kid goes over and tips the ornament. It falls over, it smashes, it breaks. The child has disobeyed the parent. When the parent returns home and discovers that the child has broken this rule and smashed the ornament, the parent then proceeds to torture their child. The parent proceeds to immiserate their child by bestowing an immense amount of suffering, grief, and torment upon them over their lifetime. At no point would you accept this as moral teaching. At no point would you think, even for a second, that this was a permissible pathway or an acceptable behavior for any parent to engage in. And before you say it in the comments below, God being God doesn't justify this. This whole might equals right is a complete and utter nonsense. And if you're going to say that might is right and you really are a divine command theorist, what you have done is sacrifice your humanity at the altar of your religion, and you are despicable, because what you're really saying there is that no matter what God does, no matter what command he gives, it is moral by definition. What you're saying is that when God flooded the world and killed its every living inhabitant except those on the ark, you're saying that this was a moral thing for God to do. What you're saying is that when God's armies wiped out the Amalekites, that this was a moral thing for God to do. What you're saying is that if God appeared right now in front of me in this video and told me to murder, rape, and steal for the rest of my life, if God told me to carry out a holocaust of evil on a particular demographic or group, you would, if you're really sticking by this principle, you would be compelled to acknowledge that such a commandment is in fact moral, righteous, and a duty for you to carry out. If that is how you think, then I'm afraid you're too far gone, and this video isn't going to save you. So guys, clearly, if God exists, and if God's chosen punishment for Adam and Eve, foreknowledge or not, if his chosen punishment for Adam and Eve was to banish them to a world of immiseration and suffering, then God is responsible for that. God is responsible for that. God chose the world that we were to fall into, and that's a world which contains so much suffering that to list it all again is frankly pointless. My final problem with the free will defense, and you probably guessed I was going to get here eventually, dear listener, but it's this. What free will? What the hell are you talking about? What free will? There's no evidence for free will. Now, guys, I'm not going to recapitulate my entire argument for determinism here, because I did a podcast recently where I spent over an hour detailing that argument. If you're interested, I would highly recommend that you check it out. But suffice to say, there is absolutely zero scientific evidence for morally significant free will. There is zero evidence that we make free choices. Choice is an illusion. And so if the free will defense's argument is that God is not responsible for evil because we freely choose our own actions, well, I'm sorry, but we're at an impasse from the word go, because there is no free will. But even according to theological standards, there's no free will. Again, if the description of God as he is presented in the Bible is accurate, well, then there cannot be free will, because theological determinism, in my view, is unavoidable. If God sees the future and God is all-knowing, that means whatever God sees in the future must occur. I'll give you a very basic example. If God knows with certainty that I'm going to do A, whatever A is, if God knows that I'm going to do A tomorrow at 3 o'clock, well, then I cannot do otherwise, can I? I cannot do otherwise. If I were to do B instead of A, God's foreknowledge would have been revealed to be incorrect, in which case God isn't really all-knowing. If God is all-knowing, what he foresees must happen exactly as he foresees it. And this is the kind of God that Christians believe in. This is the kind of God that Muslims believe in. Henceforth, theological determinism is a huge problem for anybody wishing to erect a free will defense. How can you say that free will excuses God when theological determinism shackles us to what God foresees? Now, I've heard some pretty terrible attempts to escape theological determinism. People say things like, oh, God just foresees your free choice. How is it a free choice if I cannot do otherwise? How is it a free choice if what God foresees is what I must do? I've had people say to me, oh, but if you chose B instead, God would have just foreseen that. You're now just playing with words. Let's get down to brass tacks and look at a specific instance. And I'm going to ask you this, dear listener. If tomorrow morning God foresees that I'm going to have toast for breakfast, God knows, and so henceforth can't be wrong because he is all-knowing. God knows tomorrow that I'm going to have toast. My question for you is this. Do I have the option of having cornflakes? Now, dishonest or, perhaps just ill-informed people will respond to that question and say, oh, but if you were going to have cornflakes, God would have just foreseen that. No, you cannot pivot to that here, because God in this specific instance foresees that I'm having toast. So again, my question in this specific case, so you don't get to keep saying, oh, but God would have just foreseen the other one if he chose that. No, in this specific instance, God has foreseen toast. My question is, given what God has foreseen, i.e. that I'm going to have toast, Do I have the option of having something else for breakfast? The honest answer there, dear listener, if you have followed that logical chain of reasoning, the only honest answer there is no. I do not have the option of having something else. I can only possibly have what God has foreseen. God's foreknowledge is like a train track leading into the future that we are all traveling upon. This is the problem with the omnis, guys. The so-called omniscience of God, i.e. that God is all-knowing, the omnipotence of God, that God is all-powerful, and the omnibenevolence of God, the idea that God is all-loving. These claims lead to logical contradictions. God's own foreknowledge means that even God doesn't have free will. If God knows today that he's going to do A tomorrow, that means God can't change his mind tomorrow and do B, because that would mean that his foreknowledge yesterday was incorrect. Again, there's a logical contradiction there. If God is all-powerful, can he create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it? If he can create such a rock, that means he can't lift it. So he's not all-powerful. If he is unable to create such a rock because he wouldn't be able to lift the resulting creation, well, then there's another limit on his power. The idea of an all-powerful God is self-refuting. It's contradictory. It's illogical. The idea of an all-knowing God is contradictory for similar reasons. There's logical incoherency here. And then you will have Christians who respond to my logical analysis there and say, God can do the impossible. And I'm sorry, but if that's what you're going to say, again, you have sacrificed, not your humanity in this case, you have sacrificed your intelligence at the altar of your religion. Because if you're just going to say, oh, well, God can do the impossible, after having the logical discussion and you get to the point where you realize there's no way out, so you're just going to say God can do the impossible, well, then you're not actually engaged in a project of reason. You are involved in an irrational endeavor, an illogical, evidentially bankrupt endeavor. Because what you might as well have just said is that God can draw square circles. And if you're going to say that God can draw square circles, I have no interest in having a conversation with you, because you are too far gone. So to reiterate, if indeed God is all-knowing, it's unclear how we could even possibly have morally significant free will given God's foreknowledge. Some Christians, to get out of this, will say, oh, well, God's foreknowledge is one that is garnered outside of space and time. God sees time from external and so doesn't have a causal input in it. You can add any metaphysics you want. I don't care if God's foreknowledge is external to the timeline. I don't care if God's foreknowledge is before it, after it. I don't care how you want to try and dress this up in whatever verbiage. It doesn't change the fact that before the moment I commit action A, God knows it, whether outside time, in time, before time, after time. I don't care how you want to word it. God knows before I do A that I'm going to do A, which means it's logically impossible for me to do anything other than A. And I can't call that free will. Perhaps the compatibilists in the audience, if you don't know what that is, check out my free will video. Perhaps the compatibilists in this audience will bite the bullet here and still call that freedom. I'm not willing to call that free will. And henceforth, I think the free will defense fails, guys. Not only because there's no evidence for free will, but because even on the theological point, if we assume God is real, theological determinism destroys free will as well. And guys, that brings us to the end of this video. I'm not convinced that the free will defense works. So long as there is free will in heaven, it's abundantly obvious to me that the same kind of free will could have existed on earth where there's still no moral evil. So long as the broken robot analogy holds, and I think it does, if I created a robot that was broken and killed people, you would rightly blame me as its inventor. So long as the natural evil justification in the free will defense is as weak as it appeals to the characters of Adam and Eve, a completely unscientific narrative that has no basis in fact. It is a fairy tale in a storybook. So long as the free will defense relies on that, again, I'm not convinced it's very strong. And so long as there continues to be no evidence for free will, and even on the theological account, so long as the problem of theological determinism remains unsolved, again, I can't take the free will defense seriously. One final note on that. Many theologians actually agree with the logical inconsistencies I've pointed out in this video. So much so that many sophisticated theologians today don't actually hold to the idea that God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving. They have changed the verbiage. God is now defined and described as maximally knowing, maximally powerful, and maximally loving, which is to say God knows everything that it's logically possible to know, but not anything beyond that. In terms of power, God can commit any action that's logically possible, but not anything beyond that. So no, God can't create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it, but that's not a problem because he's not all powerful, he's just maximally powerful. So God does know all things, but perhaps he doesn't know the future, because if he did know the future, it would raise the ugly spectre of the logical incoherencies and problems that I've pointed out in this video. But even then, if you change God's definition to maximally powerful, he would still be the kind of maximally powerful being who would be responsible for creating these robots that we call humans that commit holocausts and get involved in murders, thefts, and rapes. He'd still be responsible for that, wouldn't he? We would still be talking about a theology where there's a heaven where people are free. And so again, the question of why couldn't we be equally free on earth and not have moral evil would raise its ugly head. And we'd still be confronted with the ridiculous nature of the Adam and Eve narrative and how unscientific and unfounded that is. And of course, we'd still be confronted with the free will problem in that there's no evidence for it to begin with. So guys, that is my critique of the free will defense. I think it falls flat on its face. What do you think? Do you agree with my criticisms? Have I missed something here? Do you think I could have done a better job? Is there anything you can enlighten me upon? This topic specifically is incredibly complex, and there's an immense amount that I could have said and didn't because I didn't want the video to run on too long. So if there's something that you want to draw my attention to, if there's an argument that you feel I failed to address, or if there's something that you agree with me on, whatever it is, jump into the comments below and let me know. Other than that, if you did like the video, please do drop a like on it. That helps out the channel enormously. And if it is your first time visiting the channel and you like what you saw, make sure and you hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. So guys, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye bye.